There's an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean where money weighs more than a car. I'm not being poetic. The coins on this island are literally 12-foot wide stone wheels that weigh 4 tons. And the wildest part isn't the size. It's that when one of these giant stones sank to the bottom of the ocean during a storm, everyone on the island just shrugged and said, yeah, that still counts. A rock sitting on the ocean floor, completely invisible, completely unreachable. And the entire island agreed it was still worth a fortune. If that sounds insane to you, I need you to pull out your phone right now and look at your bank balance, because you're doing the exact same thing. Let's go back about 500 years. There's a tiny cluster of islands in the western Pacific called Yap. 4 main islands, surrounded by coral reef, covered in jungle, population of maybe a few thousand people. Yap had fish, Yap had coconuts, Yap had tropical hardwood, but Yap did not have one thing. Stone. Not the kind that mattered anyway. No limestone, nothing you could carve or polish into something beautiful. And according to Yapi's legend, a navigator named Anagumang set out on a voyage with 7 companions to find something rare. They paddled over 400 kilometers across open ocean in outrigger canoes until they reached a distant island chain called Palau. And in Palau, they found it. Crystalline limestone. Sparkling, pale, almost white. A rock that didn't exist anywhere on Yap. Legend says Anagumang's crew experimented with different shapes for the stone. Fish, turtles, crescent moons. But Anagumang looked up at the sky one night and chose the shape of a full moon. A perfect circle with a hole cut through the center, so you could slide a pole through it and carry it. They loaded the carved stones onto bamboo rafts, set them loose into the ocean current, and chased them home in their canoes. And that is how Yap invented money. Now here's where it gets interesting. These stones are called rai, and their value did not work like any currency you've ever seen. You might assume that bigger stones were worth more money. And yes, size mattered. A 12-foot disc was worth more than a 2-foot disc, but size was not the main thing. The most important factor in a rai stone's value was its story. How far did the stone travel? How dangerous was the voyage? How many men set out to bring it back? And here's the dark part. How many men died trying? If a crew of 20 men sailed to Palau, carved a stone, and only 8 men made it home alive, that stone was worth dramatically more than a stone brought back by a crew that had an easy trip. The stone carried the weight of human sacrifice inside its history. Every single person on the island knew these stories. They were passed down orally from generation to generation. The stone didn't just represent value. It contained a verifiable public record of human effort and human cost. But here's the part that really breaks your brain. Because these stones could weigh up to 4 tons, most of them never moved. When you paid someone with a rai stone, you didn't roll a 4-ton rock across the island to their house. You just told everyone it belonged to them now. The stone stayed exactly where it was, maybe leaning against a meeting house, maybe sitting on the side of a path where it had been for 100 years. But the entire community updated their mental record of who owned it. No bank, no paper receipt, no app, no government, just a community of people who collectively agreed. That stone now belongs to this family, and everybody remembered. This is what historians now call an oral ledger system. Every person on the island was essentially a living node in a human database, keeping track of who owned what. If you think that sounds familiar, you're right. That is literally how a blockchain works. Bitcoin is a digital currency where no physical coins exist. Ownership is just a record on a shared public ledger that thousands of computers maintain simultaneously. Nobody holds a Bitcoin. You hold a key that proves the ledger says you own it. The Yapis figured out this exact concept 500 years ago, except their computers were human brains, and their blockchain was a community-wide oral tradition, a network of people agreeing on who owns what, with no central authority controlling the record. And just like Bitcoin, rai stones derived their value from the difficulty of mining them. Bitcoin mining requires massive amounts of computational energy to solve complex math problems. That energy cost is what makes each coin scarce and valuable. Rai stone mining required sailing 400 kilometers across open ocean, quarrying limestone by hand with shell and coral tools, and hauling a multi-ton disc back on a bamboo raft. The energy cost was human lives. Different technology, identical logic. Now let me tell you the story of the stone at the bottom of the ocean. There was a crew transporting a particularly large, beautiful rai stone back from Palau. During the voyage, a massive storm hit. The bamboo raft broke apart, and the stone sank straight to the bottom of the sea. The crew survived. They made it back to Yap, and they told everyone what happened. Now here's the question that should be keeping economists up at night. Did the stone stop being money? The entire island said no. Everyone knew the stone existed. Everyone knew it had been carved. Everyone knew the story of its creation and the storm that swallowed it. The fact that no human being could ever see it, touch it, or physically reach it again did not matter, because the community agreed on its history and agreed on its owner. The stone continued to function as currency. It was traded. It changed hands. Families used it to settle major transactions, marriages, political agreements. An invisible rock on the ocean floor, participating in an economy run entirely on collective human memory. If you think that's wild, wait until the Germans showed up. In 1899, Germany purchased the island of Yap, as a colonial territory. The German administrators needed the Yapese to repair the island's roads and pathways. The Yapese didn't want to. Now, if you're a colonial power trying to force labour from a population, you'd normally threaten them with jail or violence or seize their property. But the Germans looked at the Yapese economy and realised something brilliant and terrifying. The Yapese didn't care about German marks. They didn't care about European money at all. Their wealth was in the stones. So the German officials sent agents across the island with buckets of black paint. They walked up to the most valuable rye stones, stones that had been sitting in the same spot for generations, and painted a large black cross on them. That cross meant the German government now owned the stone. The stones didn't move. Nobody touched them. Nobody hauled them away. A man just painted a mark on a rock. And the Yapese families who owned those stones were instantly bankrupted. Because in a system built entirely on community consensus about ownership, all you have to do is change the consensus. The Yapese repaired the roads, and when the Germans were satisfied, they sent the agents back to wash off the black paint. Ownership was restored. The families celebrated. Let me say that again. A group of people became poor, did manual labour, and then became rich again. And the only thing that changed in the physical world was the colour of paint on a rock. Now, here's where the story gets one final twist. In the late 1800s, an Irish-American trader named David Dean O'Keefe got shipwrecked on Yap. O'Keefe noticed that the Yapese would do almost anything for rice stones, so he made them an offer. He would use his large western ships to transport stones from Palau to Yap, faster, safer, and in much bigger quantities than the traditional canoe expeditions. He also gave them iron tools from Hong Kong, replacing the primitive shell and coral tools they'd been using for centuries. Suddenly, stones that used to take months of dangerous labour to produce could be churned out quickly and shipped back easily. O'Keefe flooded the island with new stones, and guess what happened? Inflation. The same thing that happens when any government prints too much money. The Yapese weren't stupid. They looked at O'Keefe's stones and said, "These don't count the same." The old stones carved with primitive tools transported on bamboo rafts across deadly open ocean. Those stones had stories of sacrifice. Those stones had real value. O'Keefe's stones were made with iron tools and delivered on a comfortable ship. No one died, no one suffered, so the community devalued them. The new stones were worth less, precisely because they were easier to make. The Yapese had independently discovered and rejected quantitative easing, the exact monetary policy that modern central banks use when they pump extra currency into an economy and watch the value of every existing dollar slowly erode. So let's come back to your phone. You have a number on your screen. Maybe it says $2,000. Maybe it says 50. That number is not sitting in a vault somewhere. Your bank does not have a little pile of cash with your name on it. Your money is a record on a digital ledger, maintained by a network of institutions that all agree on who owns what. You can't touch it. You can't see it. If every computer in that network lost your record, your money would simply stop existing. You are living in the rye stone economy. The only difference is that the Yapese were honest about it. They never pretended the stone needed to be in front of you to have value. They never pretended you needed to physically hold your wealth for it to be real. They understood 500 years before anyone invented a blockchain that money has never been about the object. It's about the story everyone agrees to believe. That stone at the bottom of the ocean is still worth a fortune today, and the number on your phone is worth exactly as much as everyone else agrees it is. Not 1 cent more. Right now, somewhere in London, there's a building that exists because the British government tried to burn a pile of sticks. Not dynamite, not gunpowder, not some kind of military weapon. Sticks, pieces of wood, about this long, and the fire those sticks started was so massive it burned down the entire British Parliament. But that's actually the end of the story. The beginning is way weirder. It's the year 1100. England has a new king. His name is Henry I, and Henry has a problem. His kingdom runs on silver pennies, tiny little coins stamped with his face. But the coins are garbage. See, England doesn't have a single government mint. It has about 150 independent moneyers scattered across the country, each one responsible for making coins in their own local workshop. And these moneyers are supposed to use a very specific amount of pure silver in every coin. But here's the thing about trusting 150 guys. To be honest with silver, they won't be. The moneyers were skimming, mixing cheap metal into the coins, stamping them out lighter than they should be. And the public knew it. People started cutting coins in half, just to check if the silver went all the way through. Merchants refused to accept coins unless they could physically test them first. The entire economy was grinding to a halt because nobody trusted the money. Contemporary accounts say that a man holding a full pound of coins couldn't even buy a penny's worth of bread because nobody believed the coins were real. Henry's solution was, let's say, direct. In 1124, he summoned every moneyer in England to the city of Winchester. About 150 men walked through the gates. 94 of them were found guilty of debasing the currency, and Henry had every single one of them castrated and their right hands chopped off in public. Let me say that again. The King of England gathered every coin maker in the country into one city and mutilated 94 of them in a single day. That fixed the coin quality problem pretty fast, but it didn't fix the bigger problem. Even with honest moneyers, England simply did not have enough silver. You can't run an expanding kingdom on a metal you have to dig out of the ground. Every time the king needed to fund a war, or build a castle, or pay off a local lord, he needed more silver than the mines could produce. The coins were never going to be enough. So Henry did something that sounds insane to a modern brain. He looked at a piece of wood and said, "That's money now." Here's how it worked. A clerk at the Royal Treasury would take a stick of polished hazelwood, about a foot long, squared off on the edges. Then they'd carve notches into it. Not random notches. A very specific code. A notch as wide as your palm meant £1,000. A notch as wide as your thumb meant £100. A notch as wide as your little finger meant £20. A notch the width of a swollen barleycorn meant £1. A thin slit meant 1 shilling. A single pinprick meant a penny. Then the clerk would write the payer's name and the date along the side in ink. And then they did the clever part. They split the stick in half, lengthwise, right down the middle. The longer piece was called the stock. The shorter piece was called the foil. The person who paid the money got the stock. The treasury kept the foil. And here's why this was genius. Wood grain is like a fingerprint. When you split a stick, the crack follows the natural pattern of the fibers. That pattern is completely unique. No two splits are ever the same. So if you wanted to verify a payment, you just brought the two halves back together. If the grain lined up perfectly, the record was real. If it didn't, someone was lying. You could not forge this. You could not fake the grain of a piece of wood. A medieval stick was more counterfeit proof than a modern $100 bill. Now stop and think about what just happened. The King of England in the year 1100 looked at a country full of illiterate farmers and corrupt coin makers, and invented a financial recording system that didn't require anyone to read or write. You didn't need to be educated. You didn't need to understand numbers. You just needed two pieces of wood that fit together. If they matched, the deal was real. The entire financial system of England ran on this. Tax payments, government debts, royal expenses, all of it, carved into sticks of wood. But here's where it gets really wild. The sticks started being traded. Think about it. If you held a stock that said the king owed you £100, that piece of wood had real value. You could walk up to a merchant, hand him your half of a stick and say, "The crown owes me £100. I'll sell you this claim for 80. The merchant takes the stick. He's just bought government debt at a discount. He can hold it or sell it to someone else, or eventually present it to the treasury and collect the full amount. This is exactly how modern government bonds work. And the word for the person holding that longer piece of wood, the stockholder. That is where the word comes from. Not from warehouses, not from inventory. From a guy holding a stick of hazelwood in medieval England. The London Stock Exchange, stockholder, stock market, stock options. All of it traces back to a split piece of wood. The system worked so well that it lasted for over 700 years. To put that in perspective, the United States has only existed for about 250 years. The US dollar has only existed for about 230. Paper money in Europe has only been widespread for about 300 years. A stick of wood outlasted all of them. Kings came and went. The Magna Carta was signed. The Black Death killed a third of Europe. The Renaissance happened. Shakespeare wrote his plays. The English Civil War tore the country apart. The monarchy was restored. And through all of it, the sticks kept working. Tax collectors kept carving notches into hazelwood. The treasury kept matching foils to stocks. Merchants kept trading them in secondary markets. 700 years. But then, in 1694, something changed. England founded the Bank of England. And once you have a real national bank with paper records and printed banknotes, a pile of notched sticks starts to look a little embarrassing. The government began phasing them out, slowly. By 1826, tally sticks were officially abolished. But here's the problem. After 700 years of government accounting, the Treasury had accumulated a monstrous pile of old tally sticks, cartloads of them, mountains of hazelwood, stacked in the basement of the Houses of Parliament, and somebody had to get rid of them. Now, a reasonable person might say, just throw them in the Thames, or burn them in a field, or give them away as firewood. But this is the British government. So naturally they chose the worst possible option. On October 16, 1834, a clerk named Richard Wobley was put in charge of destroying the old sticks. And Wobley had an idea. The Houses of Parliament had two big coal-burning furnaces underneath the House of Lords. Wobley told two workers, Joshua Cross and Patrick Furlong, to feed the tally sticks into the furnaces. Here's what Wobley didn't think about. Coal burns hot but slow. Low flames. Steady heat. Seasoned hazelwood burns fast and tall. Massive flames. Intense, unpredictable heat. Cross and Furlong spent the entire day shoveling 700 years of financial records into furnaces that were never designed for wood. By the afternoon, visitors to the House of Lords noticed the floor was getting hot. Smoke was seeping through the walls. Two tourists trying to look at tapestries in the Lord's chamber couldn't see anything because the room was filling with smoke, and the workers just kept shoveling. By 5 o'clock, Cross and Furlong finished their shift and went home. By 6 o'clock, the doorkeeper's wife noticed flames shooting out from under the door of the House of Lords. The copper lining inside the furnace flues had collapsed from the heat. The fire had spread into the wooden joists under the floor, and then the entire Palace of Westminster was on fire. It was the largest fire in London since the Great Fire of 1666. The House of Lords, gone. The House of Commons, gone. Hundreds of years of architecture, tapestries and records gone. Thousands of Londoners lined the riverbanks to watch their own parliament burn. A young newspaper reporter named Charles Dickens was in the crowd that night watching the flames. He later described the tally sticks as worn-out, worm-eaten, rotten old bits of wood that had managed to destroy the halls of government. The only major structure that survived was Westminster Hall, saved by the firefighters and a change in the wind. The Parliament building that stands in London today, the one with Big Ben, the one you've seen in every movie about England, that building exists because they had to rebuild after a pile of sticks burned down the original. Now let me tell you the part that history books usually skip. Before the fire, before the abolition, the tally stick system had already survived one of the most catastrophic financial crises in English history. In 1672, King Charles II was broke. He'd been borrowing heavily from London's goldsmith bankers to fund wars against the Dutch. These goldsmiths were the original bankers. They accepted deposits from ordinary people, merchants, widows, orphans, and then lent that money to the king at interest. And the king's debt to them was recorded on tally sticks. When Charles couldn't pay his debts anymore, he did something breathtaking. He announced the stop of the Exchequer, which is a fancy way of saying he simply refused to pay anyone back. £1.2 million of government debt, gone. Just like that. The tally sticks those bankers were holding became worthless overnight. Goldsmith bankers who had built their entire businesses on trusting the king's wood went bankrupt. Their depositors, ordinary people, lost everything. Some of the most powerful financiers in London ended up in debtor's prison because a king looked at a pile of sticks and said, "Those don't count anymore." Does that sound familiar? A government issuing debt instruments it can't back up? A financial system built on trust that collapses when the trust disappears? Ordinary people losing their savings because the people at the top decided to change the rules? The tally stick system experienced a sovereign debt default, a banking crisis, and institutional corruption, 700 years before anyone invented a credit default swap. And here's the part that should genuinely keep you up at night. The word exchequer itself, England's entire treasury, gets its name from a checkered tablecloth. Medieval officials would lay out a cloth with a grid pattern on a big table and use counters on the squares to calculate taxes, like a human abacus. That's the exchequer, a tablecloth and some pebbles. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, the person who controls the entire British economy today, is named after a picnic blanket. Every piece of modern financial language traces back to something absurdly primitive. Stop. From a stick of wood, exchequer. From a tablecloth, foil. From the short end of a broken twig. The entire architecture of modern finance is built on top of metaphors from the Middle Ages that nobody bothered to update. So here's what I need you to understand. The tally stick system lasted 7 centuries because it solved an eternal human problem. How do you create a record that two strangers can both trust? The answer in 1100 was split a stick. The answer in 1694 was print a banknote. The answer in 2009 was mine a Bitcoin. The technology keeps changing. The problem never does. You need two parties to agree that a record is real, and you need to make that record impossible to fake. Henry I figured that out with hazelwood and a knife, and then his government got so lazy about cleaning up after itself that it accidentally burned down its own parliament. 700 years of the most successful financial technology in human history, and it ended as a bonfire in a basement. The sticks that built an empire nearly destroyed the building that ran it, and the number on your banking app right now is the direct descendant of a notch carved into a piece of wood by a medieval clerk who couldn't read. Not one satisfying detail of that story is made up. Let's start. Imagine working your entire life to save up enough money to buy your dream house. You finally have the cash. You're holding the equivalent of millions of dollars in your hands. You walk into the market to make the purchase, but instead of buying a massive luxury mansion, you buy an onion. Well, not exactly an onion. You buy a single, completely ordinary flower bulb that looks exactly like a dirty onion. And the craziest part? Everyone around you thinks you just made the smartest financial decision of your life. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This actually happened. In the 1600s, an entire nation, the wealthiest superpower on the planet, completely lost its mind. They stopped trading gold, they stopped trading ships, and they started trading flowers. Prices skyrocketed so fast that ordinary people became millionaires overnight. People were selling their businesses, their life savings, and their actual homes just to get their hands on a single tulip bulb. And then, just as quickly as it started, the hallucination snapped. The illusion broke. In a matter of days, the greatest financial bubble in human history completely collapsed, wiping out the wealth of an entire country. This is the story of tulip mania. It is the very first time in recorded history that an entire society was infected by the mind virus of a speculative bubble. And when you look closely at how it happened, you realize that it wasn't just about flowers. It was about a devastating psychological glitch in the human brain, a glitch that is still causing massive financial disasters today. To understand how an entire country could go crazy over a flower, we have to look at the Netherlands in the early 1600s. During this time, the Dutch were the undisputed masters of the world economy. They had the strongest navy, the most advanced trading ships, and a massive global empire. They had essentially invented the modern stock market. The Dutch East India Company was the wealthiest, most powerful megacorporation to ever exist. Money was pouring into Amsterdam from all over the world. Spice trades from Asia, luxury goods from the Americas, gold, silver, you name it. For the first time in European history, there was a massive, booming middle class. Suddenly, regular merchants, bakers, and sailors had extra cash. They had disposable income. But when everyone is rich, being rich stops being special. The wealthy elites of Dutch society needed a new way to show off. They needed the ultimate status symbol. They needed something that proved they were better, more sophisticated, and more cultured than everyone else. And they found it in the most unexpected place possible. The tulip wasn't even native to Europe. It originally came from the harsh, mountainous regions of Central Asia. It was brought over by the Ottoman Empire, and eventually, a few rare bulbs made their way into the hands of Dutch botanists. To the Dutch, the tulip was unlike any flower they had ever seen. The colors were incredibly vibrant. They were bold, solid reds, deep purples, and brilliant yellows. They were exotic, incredibly fragile, and completely useless. You couldn't eat them, you couldn't use them for medicine, and they died relatively quickly. But their uselessness was exactly what made them so valuable. Owning a tulip became the ultimate flex. If you had a tulip garden, it meant you had so much money that you could literally afford to throw it away on a plant that would die in a week. Soon, the wealthy elites began competing with each other to collect the rarest, most beautiful tulips. And then, nature stepped in and created the ultimate luxury asset. A mysterious virus, known as the tulip-breaking virus, began infecting some of the flowers. But instead of killing the plant, the virus did something incredible. It caused the solid colors of the tulip petals to break, creating stunning, wildly unpredictable patterns of stripes and flames. Every single infected tulip was a unique, one-of-a-kind masterpiece. It was like a natural, physical NFT. Because the virus was unpredictable, these broken tulips couldn't be mass-produced. They were incredibly rare. The most famous of these was called the Semper Augustus. It had brilliant white petals with striking, blood-red flames running through them. It was the Mona Lisa of flowers, and everyone wanted one. As the demand for these rare tulips exploded, the prices started to creep up. At first, it was just wealthy collectors trading with each other. A rich merchant would pay a premium to get a rare bulb from a botanist. But human nature is a powerful, dangerous thing. When people see their neighbors making money, a switch flipped in their brains. Word started spreading across the Netherlands. Did you hear about the baker? He bought a tulip bulb last month, and he just sold it for double the price. Did you hear about the sailor? He traded a single flower for an entire ship. Suddenly, the tulip wasn't just a flower anymore. It was a financial cheat code. It was a guaranteed way to get rich quick, with zero actual work. The Dutch middle class realized they didn't need to sail across the world on dangerous trade routes to make a fortune. This is when the mania truly began. This is when the psychology of the crowd completely decoupled from reality. People who knew absolutely nothing about gardening were suddenly pouring their life savings into tulips. The price of tulips started doubling, then tripling, then quadrupling in a matter of weeks. But there was a massive physical problem with this new financial system. Tulips only bloom in the spring. For most of the year, they are just ugly brown bulbs buried in the dirt. You can't actually see what you are buying. To solve this, the Dutch accidentally invented one of the most dangerous financial weapons in history, the futures contract. Instead of trading the physical flower, people started trading pieces of paper that promised the delivery of a flower next spring. You could buy a contract for a tulip in the middle of winter and then sell that same contract a week later to someone else for a massive profit. The physical flower didn't even need to exist yet. The trade was entirely abstract. It was pure speculation. The market moved out of the gardens and into the local tavern. Men would sit around drinking beer, trading pieces of paper back and forth, getting rich off imaginary flowers. The prices reached levels that are almost impossible to comprehend today. At the peak of the mania, in the winter of 1636, a single Semper Augustus bulb was sold for the equivalent of a massive luxury estate in the center of Amsterdam, complete with a garden and a carriage. A single flower, traded for a mansion. People were taking out loans, mortgaging their home, and selling their family businesses to buy a piece of paper that represented a flower they had never seen. The entire country was blinded by the dopamine rush of infinite, effortless wealth. They thought the prices would just keep going up forever. They thought they had defeated the rules of economics. But a bubble is just a collective hallucination, and hallucinations always end. In February of 1637, the music stopped. No one knows exactly what triggered it. There was no massive war, no natural disaster, no new government regulation. It happened at a routine tulip auction in the city of Haarlem. A seller put a batch of tulip contracts up for auction. He asked for the usual astronomical price, but the room was silent. No one bid. He lowered the price. Still silence. He lowered it again. Nothing. For the first time in years, the supply of tulips was finally greater than the demand. In that single moment of silence, the spell was broken. The collective hallucination shattered. Suddenly, everyone in the room realized exactly what they were holding. They weren't holding mansions. They weren't holding infinite wealth. They were holding useless, fragile flowers. Panic is a virus that spreads far faster than greed. As word got out that prices were dropping, the entire country rushed to the exits at exactly the same time. Everyone wanted to sell. Nobody wanted to buy. Within a matter of days, the price of tulips absolutely cratered. The contracts that were worth an entire estate on Monday were completely worthless by Friday. Men who thought they were millionaires woke up to find themselves trapped in massive debt. Families lost their homes. Businesses were destroyed. The Dutch government tried to intervene, offering to settle the contracts for a tiny fraction of their value, but the damage was already done. The greatest economic superpower in the world had completely embarrassed itself. It was a humiliating, devastating financial disaster. Why did this happen? How could an entire society of smart, successful people fall for such an obvious trap? Because human beings are not rational creatures. We are emotional, social animals. When we see everyone around us getting rich, our biology overrides our logic. The fear of missing out, FOMO, is one of the most powerful psychological forces on Earth. It hijacks the critical thinking centers of our brain. It tells us that the rules have changed, that this time is different, and that if we don't jump in right now, we will be left behind forever. During a bubble, people aren't actually valuing the asset. They don't care about the flower. They are relying on the greater fool theory. The greater fool theory says that it doesn't matter if I buy an overpriced, useless object, as long as there is a greater fool out there who is willing to buy it from me for even more money tomorrow. But eventually, you run out of fools. And when you do, the last person holding the asset loses everything. This is why the story of Tulip Mania is so critically important today, because we are still doing it. The exact same psychological glitch is still destroying lives right now. Look at the massive financial crashes of the modern era. The dot-com bubble of the late 90s, where people poured billions of dollars into internet companies that had literally zero revenue just because they had .com in their name. The housing crisis of 2008, where people bought multiple houses they couldn't afford, convinced that real estate prices would magically go up forever. And the most perfect modern parallel, the explosion of NFTs and meme coins in the cryptocurrency space. We literally saw people trading hundreds of thousands of dollars for digital pictures of monkeys, convinced they had found a new, flawless financial system. And just like the tulips, when the music stopped, the prices crashed to zero, leaving millions of people holding worthless digital receipts. The technology changes, the assets change. Sometimes it's a piece of paper, sometimes it's a digital token, sometimes it's a flower. But the human brain never changes. We are still the exact same primitive creatures, desperately trying to get rich, quick, terrified of being left behind by the crowd. If you want to understand the wild, hidden history of money and the psychological traps that still control the global economy today, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We dive deep into the greatest financial disasters and triumphs in history, so you can see the invisible forces pulling the strings of the modern world. The next time you see a massive financial craze taking over the internet, the next time your friends are all bragging about an investment that seems too good to be true, promising infinite returns with zero risk, just take a step back and remember the Dutch. Remember the millionaires who lost everything because they convinced themselves that a dirty onion was worth more than a castle. The asset is never what matters. What matters is recognizing when the entire world has decided to share the same hallucination, because sooner or later, everyone has to wake up. Let's start. Imagine you are standing in front of the most powerful, wealthiest emperor in the history of the world. You have traveled for 3 brutal years across deserts, mountains, and oceans. You've survived bandits, disease, and starvation, expecting to finally find a kingdom dripping in solid gold, silver, and precious gems. You expect to see merchants in the grand markets trading massive, heavy chests of treasure. But instead you see something so bizarre, so completely unhinged, that when you finally return home to tell your people about it, they literally lock you up, mock you, and call you a madman. You watch merchants trading beautiful horses, fine silk, and rare spices, not for gold, but for dirty, fragile little pieces of tree bark. And the craziest part? It works perfectly. The entire empire is booming. This is the story of Marco Polo. He was an Italian merchant, an explorer, and depending on who you ask, a bit of a corporate spy. But more importantly, he was the first Westerner to stumble upon a financial cheat code that would eventually take over the entire planet. He discovered paper money. And the reason the rest of the world refused to believe him, the reason the kings and elite bankers of Europe pointed and laughed at him, reveals a massive glitch in human psychology. It is a glitch that still affects how we view money, banks, and even things like Bitcoin today. To understand why this discovery was so shocking, we have to rewind to the 13th century. In Europe, money was simple, money was heavy, money was metal. If you wanted to buy a cow, you handed over a piece of silver. If you wanted to buy a ship, you handed over a heavy chest of gold coins. This made perfect logical sense to the human brain. Humans are hardwired for physical reality. Gold is shiny, gold is incredibly rare, but most importantly, gold represents physical labor. To get a single ounce of gold, humans had to dig deep into the earth, risk their lives in dangerous mines, and refine the metal using intense heat. The gold itself was proof of the energy spent to acquire it. Therefore, gold has intrinsic value. You can melt it down, you can make jewelry out of it, you can physically bite it to make sure it's real. The idea of trading something valuable, like a house or a horse, for something totally worthless, like a piece of paper, was considered absolute insanity. It went against every basic survival instinct we evolved with. You don't trade a real apple for an imaginary apple. But this system had a massive crippling flaw. Hauling giant chests of metal across Europe was incredibly dangerous. Bandits were everywhere, waiting in the forests to ambush wealthy merchants. And worse, gold was incredibly heavy. A single merchant could only carry so much wealth before the physical weight of the gold literally stopped him from moving. Merchants were being weighed down by their own success. The physical limits of gold were holding back the growth of the entire European economy. Enter Marco Polo. In the year 1271, this young merchant from Venice decided to take the ultimate road trip. He traveled along the famous Silk Road, heading further east than almost any European had ever successfully gone. He crossed the treacherous Gobi Desert, climbed the freezing Pamir Mountains, and navigated through dangerous warlord territories. His final destination? The Grand Court of Kublai Khan, the ruler of the Mongol Empire. At the time, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. It was a terrifying, unstoppable superpower that stretched from Eastern Europe all the way to the coast of China. When Marco Polo finally arrived at the Khan's summer palace, he expected to be blinded by the gleam of infinite gold. He expected to see vaults overflowing with the spoils of conquered nations. Instead, he was introduced to the ultimate financial illusion. Kublai Khan had figured out a secret that modern governments use every single day. He realized that money doesn't actually need to be made of anything valuable. Money is just a technology. Money is just a way to keep score. And if you have absolute, unquestioned authority, you can make the score whatever you want. The Khan had created a system that left Marco Polo completely speechless. He wrote in his journals that the Khan had found the secret to alchemy. But the Khan wasn't turning lead into gold. He was doing something much more powerful. He was turning literal tree bark into gold. The emperor's guards would go out and strip the bark from mulberry trees. These were the exact same trees whose leaves were used to feed silkworms. The workers would take the fine white inner layer of the bark, mash it up, press it completely flat, and process it into a distinctive dark paper. They would then cut this paper into neat little rectangles of various sizes, representing different values. But a piece of paper is just a piece of paper. To turn it into money, it needed the magic touch of the state. Multiple high-ranking officials were required to sign their names on the notes. And then, for the grand finale, a chief officer would take a massive imperial seal, dip it in bright red vermilion ink, and stamp it dead center on the paper. The seal of the Khan. But here is the genius part. How do you convince millions of people to trade their hard-earned goods for a piece of stamped bark? Kublai Khan issued an empire-wide decree. He demanded that all gold, silver, gems, and pearls in the kingdom must be handed over to his imperial treasury. In exchange, the government gave the citizens these pieces of stamped tree bark. If you were a wealthy merchant, you would bring the emperor a heavy chest of solid gold, and his appraisers would hand you a lightweight stack of paper in return. Now, you might be asking, why on earth would anyone agree to this terrible trade? Why give up real treasure for a fragile piece of bark? Well, they didn't have a choice. The Khan attached a very simple, very terrifying rule to his new paper money. It was the ultimate enforcement of what we now call fiat currency. Fiat is a Latin word that means let it be done. It means the money has value simply because the government says it has value. But the Khan didn't just say it, he backed it up with the sword. If you refused to accept the paper bark as payment, or if you tried to trade in gold and silver secretly behind the government's back, the punishment was immediate death. You would be executed on the spot. And it wasn't just for the local citizens. When foreign merchants arrived from India or the Middle East bringing precious metals and jewels, they were strictly forbidden from selling them to anyone except the emperor's designated officials. The officials would confiscate the foreign treasure, hand the merchants paper money, and send them into the markets. And just like that, the greatest financial experiment in history was born. Marco Polo noticed something incredible. Despite the brutal enforcement, the system worked beautifully. Because everyone was forced to accept the paper, under the threat of death, the paper suddenly gained real, undeniable purchasing power. A merchant knew that if he sold his prized horses for a piece of paper, he could take that exact same piece of paper across the empire and buy food, clothing, or a house. The piece of paper had become a bridge of trust. It was lightweight, it was incredibly easy to carry, it couldn't be melted down, and it solved the massive problem of transporting heavy gold across dangerous roads. The entire economy of the Mongol Empire was booming. Trade flourished under the Pax Mongolica, running completely on an abstract hallucination enforced by military might. The Khan had successfully monopolized all the real wealth in the empire, while the citizens happily traded the illusion of wealth. After spending years in China, serving in the Khan's court, Marco Polo finally returned home to Venice. He had seen wonders that no European could even imagine. He wrote a massive, detailed book about his travel. He detailed the incredible cities, the advanced technology, the postal system, and the massive armies. But when he got to the part about the money, the Europeans stopped reading. They thought it was a complete joke. Imagine Marco Polo standing in a grand European court, surrounded by kings, nobles, and wealthy bankers. He pulls out a flimsy piece of dark paper with a red stamp on it and says, "In the East, the greatest empire in the world trades this for castles and silk." The European kings pointed and laughed at him. They mocked him. In fact, his book became known as Il Milione, which translates to The Million Lies. People thought he was a serial exaggerator. They thought his mind had been broken by the long, exhausting journey. To the European mind, trading tangible, heavy gold for a piece of paper was the definition of utter stupidity. They couldn't grasp the concept of abstract value. They were trapped by their own biology, unable to see past the physical object in front of them. Because a piece of paper didn't require thousands of hours of dangerous mining, their brains rejected it as worthless. They rejected the concept of paper money for hundreds of years. They continued dragging heavy chests of gold through bandit-infested forests, paying massive costs for security, convinced that they were the smart ones. Why were the Europeans laughing? Because they didn't understand what money actually is. Money is not gold, money is not silver, and money is certainly not paper. Money is simply a shared illusion. It is a psychological agreement between two humans that a specific token represents stored time and energy. The physical form of the token doesn't matter. It never mattered, whether it's giant stone wheels on an island, tiny cowrie shells in Africa, or stamped tree bark in China. It only works if we all collectively agree not to laugh at it. The Europeans laughed because they lacked the collective trust to make the illusion work. They needed the physical weight of gold to feel secure. And here is the modern lesson. We still suffer from this exact same psychological glitch today. Look at how people react to modern financial innovation. For a long time, modern paper money was still backed by gold. You could theoretically take a US dollar to a bank and trade it for physical metal. But in 1971, President Richard Nixon officially took the United States off the gold standard. He essentially did exactly what Kublai Khan did. He severed the tie between physical treasure and paper money. The entire global economy was suddenly running purely on trust and government authority. And people panicked. Where is the physical backing? How can numbers on a screen be real? We saw the exact same psychological glitch happen again when Bitcoin was introduced. When digital cryptocurrency first appeared, the financial elites of Wall Street pointed and laughed, just like the European kings laughed at Marco Polo. They called it magic internet money. They said it was backed by absolutely nothing. They demanded physical, tangible assets. But they missed the exact same secret that Kublai Khan figured out over 700 years ago. Value is not physical. Value is trust. Today, every single modern economy runs entirely on fiat currency. The US dollar, the euro, the yen, none of them are backed by gold. They are backed by the exact same thing Marco Polo witnessed in China. The authority of the government, the threat of force, and the collective hallucination of the billions of people who use it. We trade our time, our labor, and our entire lives for little pieces of green paper, or increasingly, just digital numbers sitting on a banking app's server. If you want to understand the invisible illusions that control your wallet, your time, and your future, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We explore the crazy, hidden history of money so you can finally understand how the modern financial world actually works. The next time you pull a $20 bill out of your wallet, take a really close look at it. It has no intrinsic value. You can't eat it. You can't build a house with it. It is, quite literally, just modern tree bark with a fancy seal stamped on it. The only reason it works, the only reason it can buy you a meal or pay your rent, is because we have all collectively agreed to play the game. We have all agreed to accept the hallucination. But Marco Polo knew the truth. He knew that the greatest magic trick in human history wasn't pulling a rabbit out of a hat. It was convincing the entire world that paper was exactly the same as gold.